course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Now that, of course, is the opening of the manifesto of the British Labour Party for the upcoming general election on the 4th of July. Actually, it's from the Declaration of Independence, which was declared, not signed, on the 4th of July, 1776. However, we are recording this on the 2nd of July, which is the day it was actually signed, in the year 2024. And the United Kingdom, ironically, is holding a general election on the 4th of July in 2 days. So we at Short Circuit thought that this would make for an episode where we can tie our two nations together in some way. So we're going to do that today on Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagement at the Institute for Justice. So again, recording this July 2nd. So some of you listening to this after July 4th will know a little bit about what happens over in the UK when they have their election thingy in a couple days. But we had our revolution thingy a long time ago. And some of you may know some of the details of what that means as a constitutional matter. Now, we often hear about at the 4th of July how we threw off the king and, we didn't have the king over the United States anymore and we're going to have a republic and blah, 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 blah. That's all very well known. What sometimes gets forgotten is that we didn't just reject the British king, but the British system, the system of having a parliament that can do whatever it wants. And so instead we had a written constitution and constitutional law of that nature instead of the British Constitution. But we did a funny thing at the same time. We kept the British, or the English really, legal system. So we kind of got a new constitutional system, kept the legal system, and we even constitutionalized some of the legal system, like the right to a jury trial. So anyway, I wrote about some of this in a piece that just came out at Discord, not Discord, that's the chat thing, Discourse magazine run by our friends at the Mercatus Center. So we'll put a link in the show notes to that if you want to read about the connections between Britain and America, but how America is different, especially when it comes to judicial review. But today we thought it would be fun to talk about some stuff that unites the two countries, including this thing about a jury trial. So we have two cases about some looser than others, a British-American connection. One of them is a big case that just came out at the Supreme Court. So usually we don't do Supreme Court opinions on this show, but this is a big case. We have experts who know a lot about this area. We even are litigating these same kinds of claims here at IJ. So I thought it was perfect to bring back a very recent guest to the show, and that is Rob Johnson, because Rob is actually a lawyer in these other IJ cases. We also, though, are having Andrew Ward back to the show. He's been here many times before, and this time he is going to also give his opinion about this new case, Jarkesy, SEC versus Jarkesy from the Supreme Court. But then he's going to take us on a little bit of a crime caper that has to do with a British consul. So, gentlemen, welcome back to Short Circuit.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I feel like I should be clapping for the excellent words of personal favorite founding father Thomas Jefferson that you opened with there. Go America.
They say he wasn't the only author of the Declaration. It's a little disputed exactly how many of those words are his, but thank you nonetheless. So Rob, Jarkesy, this people were watching this case. It was a little unclear what was going to happen, but it seems like it's a pretty big deal when all is said and done.
Yeah, it's huge. It's probably the biggest opinion of the term at the court. And since we are talking about the circuit courts, I have to say, the Fifth Circuit had a rough term at the Supreme Court. They got reversed. I'm going to get the exact numbers wrong. I think I read somewhere it's 7 cases and they got reversed in 5 of them, which,
2 of them IJ cases.
Yeah. But, on the plus side for the Fifth Circuit, they got affirmed here. And this is probably the biggest case of the term. So maybe this is like an example of, you got to swing big if you want to hit home runs. And, you're going to miss a bunch, but then maybe, from the Fifth Circuit's opinion perspective, like maybe it's worth it, right? You get reversed a ton, but then the one time you get affirmed, it like is going to completely change the structure of the federal bureaucratic state in significant ways that you like. So, the Fifth Circuit gets a lot of, people make fun of them for their reversal rate, but maybe they're onto something. So Jarkesy, this case is it arises out of an SEC proceeding where the SEC imposed hundreds of thousands of dollars of penalties on this guy, George Jarkesy, who is a sort of interesting figure. He's a Tea Party guy. He's politically active. He also runs hedge funds with like sort of Tea Party-esque names like Patriot 28 and things like that. And he gets accused by the SEC of various wrongdoings and gets this huge monetary fine. And he then goes to federal court and he says, hey, this is the kind of thing that you have to do in a real court. If you're going to fine somebody, you can't do that in an agency court where you don't get a jury and where the judge is employed by the very same administrative agency that employs the prosecutors. You've got to go to a real court and give people a real judge and a real jury. And when he, first starts this, we've had a number of cases where we've been raising these claims, but for the most part, this is like, greeted with shock and disdain from the legal establishment. It's like, oh no, that's not how this works. Agencies all across the federal bureaucracy are, imposing fines on people all the time, and surely that's not unconstitutional. But then the Fifth Circuit issued this huge Jarkesy opinion, and they said, actually, no, it is unconstitutional. And it was greeted with, a front page New York Times article, like, this is the end of the world. And, it's the Solicitor General petitioned for cert, the court granted it, and then the court affirmed. And so, I guess the world has ended.
Well, I feel fine.
Yeah, no, at the end, it's the end of the world, and we all feel fine, I think. And so the upshot of this opinion is the Supreme Court basically says that, if you are going to take somebody's money by fining them, and you're going to impose this kind of a fine for some sort of wrongdoing, that's the sort of thing that historically at common law in the courts of Westminster, there's our British connection, had to be tried to a jury in the common law courts. And we have the Seventh Amendment that is trying to preserve the right to trial by jury. So in America today, you still got to try that to a jury. There's no SEC exception to the right to a jury.
Why is that in the Constitution, Rob? Why did they care so much in the late 18th century about trial by jury?
Oh, what an excellent question. Well, so this gets us to the Justice Gorsuch writes this just excellent concurrence. And he goes into a lot of this history. And what Justice Gorsuch explains is you've got, at the time of the founding, the British were very suspicious of the American colonists as jurors. And they basically didn't think those raggedy colonists were going to apply the law if they were put on a jury. So instead of having jury trials, they started moving cases out of the local colonial courts into what they called the vice admiralty courts. And these are basically, vice because they were underneath the high admiralty court back in England. And the judges on these admiralty courts were put in place by the English. They often had dual roles, so sometimes they were both prosecutor and judge, and there was no right to trial by jury. And, that was kind of accepted for admiralty. But the British started actually moving all kinds of cases over into the Vice Admiralty Court. And the colonists didn't like it. They didn't like that they were losing their right to trial by jury. And so that was actually one of the things that they complained about in the Declaration of Independence. So Justice Gorsuch lays all that out. And, it was sort of an interesting concurrence. He says it's not just the Seventh Amendment that was enacted in reaction to that. He says it was also, there's Article 3, which says that the judicial power of the United States extends to cases both, in law, but also in equity and in admiralty, and says that for all of those cases, you got to have judges who have life tenure and who are protected from removal and enjoy all of these protections, which, the Vice Admiralty courts, those didn't have that.
Although ALJs are protected from removal. They're very protected from removal.
But not as much as a federal judge. So they have some protection from removal, but they can be removed. A federal judge, right, a real Article 3 judge has to be impeached if you want to get rid of them. But an ALJ, you just have to go to this administrative board and convince them to let you fire them, which, it's not easy, but you can do it. The bigger difference is ALJs have no salary protection. So ALJs actually can have their salary. They may have some, statutory protections, but it actually has happened. For instance, during government shutdowns, that ALJs don't get paid. They don't have the same level of independence that federal judges do. And also all of that is just by statute. It's not by constitution, so it could be changed. And of course, there's also a huge constitutional question of whether that removal is itself unconstitutional. Those removal protections are themselves unconstitutional.
As the Fifth Circuit held, but the Supreme Court did not reach.
That's correct. So the Supreme Court basically said, well, we reached the Article 3 issue. We don't have to reach the removal question, which does actually raise an interesting question. Is the removal holding still good law in the Fifth Circuit?
Presumably. I don't see why not, right? I mean, the judgment's affirmed.
I think that's right.
Yeah, so it should be.
What about the non-delegation part?
I think that's probably still good law too, right? The court didn't reach any of it. So the court basically says we affirm on Article 3 ground, we don't touch the other stuff. I think that leaves the other stuff in the Fifth Circuit, not nationwide, but I think in the Fifth Circuit, it's all still good law.
The way you're phrasing it is kind of interesting. Is it Article 3 or is it the Seventh Amendment? Because if it's just the right to trial by jury, I mean, can the SEC at the Supreme Court level or in other circuits outside the Fifth Circuit, right, could because these are the important questions, the real world consequences, and not agency win rates are going to drop by half. Could they set up a jury system inside the SEC in front of an ALJ? Maybe.
So I don't think they could. So there's the opinion actually does talk about this in terms of the Seventh Amendment, and that's because George Jarkesy and his lawyers raised a Seventh Amendment claim. So that's kind of how it comes to the Supreme Court, and they talk about it in terms of the jury. But the analysis under Article 3 in the Seventh Amendment has always been essentially they dovetail together. So if you have a case that is, has to be within the Article 3 courts, then, you get a right to trial by jury. If it doesn't have to be outside the article, if it can be outside the Article 3 courts, then the courts have always said, well, then you don't have to provide a jury. So the two analyses are done in parallel. And it's the same question of does it involve public rights or does it involve private rights? So cases that involve private rights have to be litigated in the Article 3 courts. And then if they are legal in nature, you have to provide a jury. If they involve public rights, then you can take them outside of the Article 3 courts and you can do them in an agency. And that's the same analysis for both the Seventh Amendment and for the Article 3. So I don't know that actually works.
No, I mean, probably it doesn't. But the public rights distinction is important, right? Because most ALJs are in the Social Security Administration dealing with various benefits. So many things are still going to stay in the administrative process after this decision. But some kind of fines, at the very least fines for sort of things that rhyme with common law actions, maybe something broader, maybe even all fines. But some things are certainly going back into to real court, which, love for the ALJs out there. I don't know. It's kind of disparaging, but there's definitely a difference. I have been in administrative court before. There were some interesting aspects to that, like the government could get discovery, but the respondent couldn't. That was weird.
Yeah, I mean, there's something very troubling where the judge is literally employed in the very same building, in the same offices as the prosecutors. And sometimes, these administrative judges, not the case of these ALJs necessarily, but a lot of administrative judges, they do double duty. So like in the EPA, for instance, they have a whole class of judges who both prosecute and bring enforcement actions and also judge cases. And they don't, they're not doing it in the same case, but it's like, I might prosecute cases and then you're the judge in my cases, and you prosecute cases and I'm the judge in your cases.
Wait, that really happens?
Oh, yeah.
That's nuts. That's that's bananas. That's obviously crazy.
Yeah, there's all kinds of crazy stuff that goes on. So, this is a really important decision in terms of establishing the independence of the judiciary. And we joke about the sky falling, but it's true. In our amicus, we actually went through, in our amicus brief, we went through and we, counted up all the different federal agencies that have ALJs. And it basically turns out that there are thousands of ALJs in the federal government, like 90% of them are employed by the Social Security Administration, processing Social Security claims, which, that's like a quintessential public right. That's the sort of thing that can be done in the agency, and that's not going to change, right? So if you're an ALJ who's listening to this, which maybe there are a couple, I kind of doubt it, but maybe, who knows? I don't know.
Dozens of us.
If you're a federal, ALJ who's listening to this, I think you can rest assured, like, your job is probably safe. You're not going anywhere. There's lots of Social Security claims to process and things like that. But so the sky's not falling, but for people who are being targeted for fines, this is a really good decision. I should note there's also a dissent from Justice Sotomayor. And on the topic of things that are British, it's a very British dissent, because what Justice Sotomayor basically says is that the government is sovereign, and she uses that word, the government is sovereign. And if the government in its sovereign power decides that it wants to prosecute a case in an agency, then there's nothing that the courts, should have to say about it. And that those are, anything involving the government involves the public rights of the sovereign as sovereign, and that can be heard in agency courts. And my first reaction to that, and this goes to Anthony's article, which, we don't have to get into all the substance of it, but it's a very good article. And one thing that Anthony points out is the biggest difference between the British system and the American system is that, in the American system, the government's not sovereign, the people are sovereign. So, I read that from Justice Sotomayor and I thought, this is very British, and it's wrong.
And the people is not the same thing as Congress or the legislature. I mean, I think that's the thing that people really get confused, is they're elected by the people, but in the old British system, Parliament to some extent was elected. Now it's much more elected. But Parliament itself, along with the Crown, was the sovereign. So if Congress does something, it's not like the sovereign is commanding, X. I mean, we say that a lot. She's saying that, but that's not really how this system is supposed to be thought of.
I thought it was very interesting that her dissent ends with, like, there are good policy reasons, like greater efficiency and uniformity if we just let the SEC keep its, like, 99% win rate. And I mean, yes, but a lot of the things in the Constitution are sort of anti-efficiency for the sake of other higher values. So that particular line didn't really resonate with me.
Yeah, I think the rule that the dissent is advocating for is also just kind of a frightening rule, right? So the government, the theory that the dissent is adopting is basically, and this is the government's argument in the case too, that any time the government brings an enforcement action against an individual, that involves public rights, and so it can be heard in an agency. So, if you sue me for, $100,000 in damages, I don't know what I did to you, but I did something, and you're suing me for $100,000 in damages. That involves our private rights. And so that case goes to real court. But if the government sues me for $100,000 and says I did something wrong and they're going to take $100,000, then that doesn't get a real judge. Instead, you can have a judge who's employed by the very same agency that is prosecuting you and trying to take your $100,000. So, I mean, that's like pretty wild.
But shouldn't we assume the powers of the executive will always be exercised responsibly by our own political allies and people that we like?
And we just don't
Because then it'll be fine, right? Like, we shouldn't have to worry about it.
We just don't criminally prosecute the executive for doing those things. But otherwise, it's okay.
Yeah.
That's another case that we're not going to talk about today. I wanted to do a little bit of fun, do a little bit of pushback, Rob, what you were just talking about, but more to maybe educate some of our non-lawyer listeners on the interplay of the different rights to trial by jury in the Constitution, because I think some people, when they come to this case, get a little confused because there's actually different. I think our intuitions are actually not quite what the Constitution says, even though the Constitution leads us to where the court came out here. So when people think about trial by jury and the government like fining you, what most people are thinking about is a criminal prosecution. But actually, that's the Sixth Amendment, and the Sixth Amendment guarantees your right to trial by jury in a criminal case, but this isn't a criminal case. And it has been interpreted to not give you a trial by jury if it's just fines. I mean, I can't remember the case, but there's this case from the 70s, I think, that says if you're prosecuted and the potential sentence is going to be 6 months in incarceration or more, then you get a jury trial. But less than that, you don't. I think it has to do with incorporation doctrine too, is why I'm going back to my crim pro days in law school for saying that. But anyway, so it says in Sixth Amendment, in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall be committed. Okay, so that's what the Sixth Amendment says, and that's actually been incorporated against the states. So, but that's criminal prosecution. So if the government comes after you civilly, which is what this SEC thing has, then we get to the Seventh Amendment in suits at common law, where the value and controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved. So that's another question of whether it's at common law, which you were talking about earlier, and then there's the public rights exception. And then we have Article 3, which says that, judges shall have good behavior and all that. Although, if truth be told, right, Congress never actually had to create trial courts under Article 3. It just could. So, it could have been in a parallel universe. We could have lived in a world where the SEC was doing this stuff in state court, not even in, jury trial, or not even in before its own ALJs. And then, God knows what would have governed there about jury trials. So throwing all that stuff together, you get a sense, you just kind of get a libertarian sense that if the government's coming after you for way more than $20 in fines, you should get a jury trial. But to get it there, you kind of have to go through this. It's a suit at common law. Otherwise, you don't have something directly on point. Am I right about all that, or is some of that maybe wrong?
Well, I don't think you're wrong, but I think there's so two thoughts. One is that there is actually another provision that you didn't mention that Justice Gorsuch points out is critical here, right? And that's the due process clause.
Right.
And, the government can't take your life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And what Justice Gorsuch says is that was understood to mean for imposing fines, that was understood to mean a real court, right? Not this pseudo court in an administrative agency. So I think due process here is the due process clause is kind of the other missing piece to all of this. to the extent that these other provisions don't specifically address something, I think due process is still the overriding idea that they had was this stuff's going to go the traditional way we did it was you go to court and like we're going to still do that. And we're not going to have these newfangled vice admiralty courts or the SEC or any of this.
And this is to Andrew's point, this is a part where I think history and tradition really do help understand what the purpose of it is that the whole background about vice admiralty courts and the Seventh Amendment, unlike maybe some other times where history and traditions they've gotten a little too crazy lately.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, sometimes history and tradition, you can the court ends up kind of looking for analogs and trying to find it's like looking for faces in a crowd. It's like, we want to uphold this, so let's find things where this was done, or we want to strike it down, so let's find places where it wasn't done. And, it's sort of like Justice Scalia said about statutory interpretation and legislative history. Like, you're just looking for faces in the crowd that support what you want to do. And that whole analysis can feel problematic in a lot of ways. But this is like a good use of history where we're looking at a set of constitutional provisions and we're thinking, what animates this? What is it about? And by knowing that, we can understand why these administrative agencies are just so problematic and not in line with what the Constitution says.
A huge 1/3 of a 1, 2, 3 sort of combo against the administrative state at the end of the term, along with the overruling of Chevron deference, and then also the sort of there is no statute of limitations anymore to challenge agency regulations in corner post, and those 3 cases, all individually but especially put together, are a big deal.
My idiosyncratic view on this, and so how important a case is in some sense both unknowable and maybe like almost not even worth discussing because it's so unknowable. But my idiosyncratic view on this is that Jarkesy is the most important, corner post is the second most important, and the Loper Bright is the third most important, which is probably I recognize this is controversial.
I reject your implicit rejection of this topic and continue on the topic. I think it's Loper Bright is the most important, then Jarkesy, then corner post.
Yeah, see, my view on this though is that who the judge is typically more important than what standard they are applying. This is my maybe slightly jaundiced view as a litigator, but
that's a very reasonable point. I'll give you that for sure.
Do you think so? This is we didn't prep for this at all, but so Corner Post, for listeners' benefit, said that when a new rule comes out from an administrative agency, there was an argument that you could only challenge it on its face in the first 6 years. And if it's after that, you could only challenge it as applied. But the Supreme Court has said, the majority said, no, you can apply it, whenever later on as a facial matter. Is that, as a practical matter, a big deal, Rob, with a lot of adjudication? There are a lot of facial challenges that they just don't happen because they were more than 6 years that now can happen.
Yeah, so it allows people to go back and challenge regs that maybe have been on the books for a long time, but either they were challenged, but they were challenged in a different era when the courts had a different view of things, or no one challenged them, maybe because it was a different era and courts had a different view of things. It just opens the door to go back and start and challenge regulations that have been on the books for potentially a long time, and to get rulings on whether those regulations are legal, whether they're constitutional. So it's a big deal. It's potentially a big deal. And I kid. I think obviously overruling Chevron is a big deal. You can't deny that it's a big deal. I would just, I don't know how many judges really have been following Chevron for the last 20 years anyway. So
the Supreme Court hasn't been. But.
No.
Well, that is a little bit of a history lesson on our old relations with the United Kingdom. But we still have relations, usually good relations, today, including with some of its ambassadorial staff. So, Andrew, what happened to a certain member of that staff in Houston?
Yeah, well, a consul general is not an ambassador. Let's be clear
Well,
about
he's
that up
part of the
front.
staff,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Of the
What
the
is a
mission.
consulate general? Let's start with that.
Hold on. Let me tell you what happened first. Let me tell you about what is
Okay.
going on with the current relationship of American citizens to UK ones. So I'm going to go to an unpublished, because it's really much more interesting on the facts, decision out of the Fifth Circuit. This is United States of America versus Darian Benjamin Woods. It's a sad but lively tale. And I'm just going to read the facts, which are basically in one paragraph. So Woods and his co-defendant, Kristen Brinkley, broke into the British Consul General's family home in Houston, Texas. Security footage from the home showed Woods driving a U-Haul truck through the home's security gate, entering the property, and carrying items back to the truck. Woods and Brinkley stole 2 vehicles, a safe, high-end watches, jewelry, a television, the family's passports and personal documents, and a large amount of alcohol. Put a pin in that. They ransacked the home and caused over $50,000 in damages.
What do you think the vehicles were?
I don't know. Maybe they're sort of diplomatic, special plates cars.
But they're already driving a U-Haul.
So how did they in shifts? You steal one, you walk.
I'm wondering
back,
if they were
I don't
mopeds
know.
or something like that they just threw them in the back of the truck.
Oh, I don't know. Vehicles is probably chosen for a reason, though. I got that this was a per curiam unpublished decision by Judges Higginson, Willett, and Oldham, and it had a certain crispness to it that I think sounds to me like Andy Oldham. So I think the word vehicles was chosen for a reason in a way that might include mopeds. I don't think this was
no vehicles in the park.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'm sure these were unambiguously vehicles. I don't think this is like an HLA Hart thing. I don't think Justice Willett wrote it. It didn't have quite his particular panache. But the important thing about this case, right, is that the Americans are once again rising up against the British, and it basically gives short circuit listeners an excuse to hear about what a consul general is, which is part of the diplomatic staff of a country, but not the ambassador. So the ambassador is the highest ranking person in a diplomatic staff or mission, the ones who are responsible for real issues of policy, treaties, things like that. A consul is someone who is generally helping relations and the citizens of the home country in the foreign country. So there are, in fact, many British consulates all around the United States. Some of them are consulates, like in Denver. In bigger cities, though, you have consuls general, as in Houston and Chicago, Boston, Atlanta, various other cities around the United States. So a consul general outranks a consul, obviously outranks a vice consul. But they are not as important as ambassadors, and they're doing things like helping, the local UK citizens get passports and deal with things on taxes. So this is more the sort of when you think of maybe you're traveling abroad, you lose your passport, you sort of go to the embassy, but for help, not to negotiate a treaty. That sort of for help thing is the sort of thing that consuls general are responsible. So not to be confused with Dame Karen Pierce, Lady Roxburgh, the current ambassador since 2020. She is in D.C., being very important at the embassy. This is merely the consul general hanging out in Houston.
I think under him, though, there are the consuls, and they can be very kind of part-time even. It'll just be a law office, and it'll be an honorary, in case there are any Brits who happen to be in the area.
Yeah, well, there's an entire, diplomatic system that stems, of course, from the 1815 Congress of Vienna in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, setting up ambassadors on top of the ministers plenipotentiary, going on down your aides and ministers d'affaires and all sorts of different things. These were simplified later in the 20th century, but there are still many important forms about this where a consul general would rank on a matter of protocol. In the U.S. system, a consul general is akin to, but below, a brigadier general. So if you had a mixed, military and diplomatic fancy dinner where you had to decide the seating arrangements, more important than a colonel, less important than a brigadier general or a real admiral. So, a consul general is no joke, but it's also not the ambassador herself.
Sounds like maybe you've been to one of these dinners that you know this stuff.
I mean, this is not a podcast about my personal life. I'm not. Maybe. I'm not. We're not gonna go into that.
Do we think these people had a residence, or was this just like their family house?
Well, I think the opinion describes it right as their
Family home.
Yeah. But whether that's given to them by, it wouldn't surprise, like certainly the ambassador, of course, has like an ambassadorial residence, and a consul general, I would guess, given the nature of the job, it probably is a piece of property owned by the sovereign, but indirectly.
I'm just kind of wondering if Mr. Woods knew what he was getting into.
Yeah, I wonder that too. Well, I mean, they have an office. The consul general office is separate from the home. It has an office address. But I mean, they took the safe and the passports. That makes me think maybe they knew what they were targeting.
They were probably just in the safe, right? Why would you steal the consul general's passport?
That's a pretty cool passport. You have diplomatic immunity if you get arrested. Well, I'm surprised Woods didn't, try and pull that.
I mean, you think it was careful, like in Ocean's 11, like I'm going to get this guy's passport. He looks sufficiently like me that this is all going to work. But we should finish the story of what happens to Mr. Woods. So because he's not actually convicted of residential burglary, specifically, it was damaging property occupied by a foreign official. Almost certainly being the federal hook. His guidelines range is relatively low. He ends up with and this is of course the big manual of good and evil, where a federal court in criminal sentencing sort of like weighs your sins and tries to figure out exactly how precisely you should deserve to be punished. And his guidelines range is only in around a year, but the court varies upward. Sentences him to 30 months, and the Fifth Circuit, as anyone could expect from an unpublished per curiam Fifth Circuit opinion, says no, obviously not. You have behaved very seriously. You're lucky, you didn't have a base level of 17 for committing residential burglary. You have all these other things that weren't even factored into your record, like juvenile crimes, like fighting in, like he beats up his cellmate or something. And so, of course, the court affirms a 30-month sentence, which I am not the biggest fan of the carceral state. I think in the sentencing guidelines, the table that says what you actually get, you should probably divide all the numbers by 4. But even I think 30 months for like a serious residential burglary sounds pretty fine. Plus, whatever inestimable harm he has done to American-UK relations. But perhaps a more interesting point of the sentencing is that Mr. Woods loves his alcohol. He loves drinking, and he doesn't do it that much anymore, but he sometimes drinks to excess. And at oral pronouncement of the sentence, the district court says that while he is in drug treatment program, he is not allowed, as a condition of his sentence, to drink alcohol to excess. But then in the written sentencing order that comes out, it just says he can't drink alcohol to excess. And you're Anthony, you're looking like you want to interject. I hope I'm saying it.
Well,
right.
no, you're saying it right. So basically, where it was supposed to be orally when he's part of this program, which is really about his substance abuse, he can't drink alcohol to excess. But the written order says alcohol to excess, which I'm guessing would be through his probationary period. And the most interesting thing to me is how the court put it, and whether it was Judge Oldham and his clerks or Judge Willett or whoever, I think this was not an accident that it was written this way. Woods said he began consuming alcohol as a teenager, and although he only drinks on rare occasions, when he does, it is excessive. I don't know if he drinks Dos Equis, but I think that was in the back of the mind of whoever.
Well, and just as a note, the list of things that were stolen from the house includes a large amount of alcohol.
Yeah. Which he's not going to drink all the time. And so, and it's funny that he challenged, ultimately what happens is he challenges this condition on appeal because the written pronouncement, the writing, which is that he shall not consume alcohol to excess, conflicts with the oral pronouncement, which is that he shall not consume alcohol excessively while he's in the drug treatment program that's part of his. And this guy's like, he's already got the ability to drink alcohol. He's only limited from consuming it excessively. Apparently that's not super important. That's not sufficient for him. He wants at least sometimes to be able to drink alcohol to excess. And so he challenges the written restriction as inconsistent with the oral pronouncement. There actually is a settled, very black letter rule that is the oral pronouncement that controls. We were sort of debating before we started recording, what's going on? Who appealed this? Why did this happen? My working theory is that, he was trying to get his sentence cut in half because he got this substantially above guideline sentence. But while he was up there, his attorney threw him a bone and said, sure, I'll get that alcohol restriction removed. And the Fifth Circuit removes it.
I did pull up the brief. So he was represented by the Federal Public Defender's Office, and they raised two separate issues on appeal. The first was the length of the sentence, and the second was the alcohol thing. So, that's your tax dollars at work.
Batting 500.
Well, I don't know. Is this like a litigation tactic? Is this the opposite of don't bring too many weak issues? What if I bring a second issue that doesn't matter, but where I'm clearly right on the black letter law? Does that increase my credibility and show that, suspicious things that should be reversed were happening below?
That might have been their thinking. Maybe they're thinking, well, if they're going to send it back on the alcohol thing anyway, maybe they'll send it back on the first issue.
Well, they send it back for technical, clerical, vacator. So Mr. Woods, residential burglar, is doing his 30 months, but he will be able to drink excessively while outside of drug treatment. And that is the end of this per curiam case that is just as important as rolling back the administrative
But he won't
state.
be able to drink His Majesty's government's alcohol because that was recaptured when they found him.
He won't get to use the passports if there was.
I'm guessing the large
there.
amount of alcohol they must have, fancy dinners and of an ambassadorial nature sometimes, or
it's just a
consular
consul
nature.
general. It's just a
Yeah.
consul general.
Yeah, but he's like the biggest Brit in Texas, right? So there must be, I don't know, heads of oil companies, or he's trying to do trade stuff. They probably have fancy dinners there.
That's a fair point. I hope those dinners weren't delayed while they were missing their fancy alcohol.
And I just want to push back on it a little bit. It says when they found them, they found some of the stolen items. So we don't know from the face of the opinion whether all of the alcohol was ever recovered.
That's a good. I comb the record super hard when I'm putting together a summary judgment motion, but I admit that I did not apply 100% of my usual lawyerly scruples to reviewing the details of this case.
Maybe the alcohol is buried somewhere in Texas still. We don't know.
Hidden. Yeah, it could be rare casks of fancy European vintages, not from England, obviously, but that they bought.
Be
from
port,
else in
I
Europe.
think, is what you would have, because of the England's oldest ally is Portugal, as they say. So that's what you would have at the ambassadorial dinner.
Yeah, so on the one hand, I like that we're still throwing off the yoke of our oppressors, but on the other hand, burglary is probably immoral, and we're pretty cool with them now. So I don't know. Don't rob British foreign officials.
What I was thinking is whether he knew this was a big British consular fellow or not. If he did he get a better deal because he was in federal court than in Texas state court? Or I can't think they go easy on this type of burglar. I don't know Texas criminal procedure and sentencing guidelines and all that, but
they have a whole separate state Supreme Court just to be harsh on criminal law.
So maybe it was good for him that
maybe he got
this
lucky.
guy happened to be a general consul.
Yeah, 30 months instead of 30 years. Who knows? It's a weird time to in the life of Mr. Woods.
Well, for those of you interested in British American relations, we did a show actually a little over a year ago about the British Constitution, and with a couple fellows who edited a book on the changing British Constitution. So we'll put a link in the show notes to that if that's your thing. That was our biggest ever foreign audience, I believe, by the way, was that podcast, because we can track who listens to this stuff, not individually, but by country.
Doctors will make you say that if you have like a stroke. British Constitution, because it involves your tongue so much to make all the consonants. It's like testing whether your hypoglossal nerve works, or your vagus nerve. It's both. But I just wanted to come in hard with the weird facts for our July 4th podcast.
I did not know that. But,
everything about Britain.
But I think that everyone should be thinking about that this 4th of July, whether you are celebrating the American Declaration of Independence, or whether you're voting in the UK for our UK listeners and selecting a new government. I hope you have a brilliant 4th of July, as they say across the pond. And for everyone else, I hope that you all get engaged.
This was the charter of the land.